Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we focus on the current travails of the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. After the elections of early summer, Johnson seemed master of all he surveyed. The pandemic was on the way and the opposition parties at Westminster in serious disarray. The vaccination programme has soared away success. The economy showing signs of recovery, and Brexit was done and dusted. July demonstrated, however, that a month is a long time in politics. Johnson lost 2 by-elections and a cabinet secretary. His new health secretary promptly caught COVID-19, and the Prime Minister and Chancellor performed an ungainly U-turn on self-isolating. But the only good news for the beleaguered Boris is that his wife Carrie is pregnant again. The pandemic is resurgent, the economy stalling. Brexit and Northern Ireland remain unfinished business. Refugees are sailing across the English Channel, and he is being tormented by his former top advisor Dominic Cummings, and to cap it all, England lost the Euro finals to Italy. As a result, the Johnson ratings have plunged dramatically. The Prime Minister has dropped no less than 36 points in the Conservative Home League table. Indeed, the only cabinet minister substantially below Boris is the permanently unpopular Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson. So is this a temporary blip, or is the Prime Minister self-combusting? Today on the Alex Salmond Show, we turn to the expertise of a man who knows the answers about the longevity of the occupants of 10 Downing Street. Steve Richards, author of The Prime Ministers. This key interview coming up soon, but first your tweets, emails and messages in response to our show last week on to vaccinate or not to vaccinate. Terry says, great to hear Alex calling an injection a jag. It was always a jag in Scotland and not a jab. I seem to remember. Well, so do I. Another great show. Cheers. Fiona Brown says, I'm no longer responsible for a child. My approach would be to ask my son for his views and willingness, or otherwise. I check with his GP re any contract indications. Assuming all clear and son willing, it would be a big green light from me. Gordon Mackenzie says, indeed, the JCVI have got this totally wrong. Protect the teenagers, their parents and grandparents by giving COVID jags to 12 plus immediately, and possibly younger ages later. Tracy Ann Wiseman says, very much looking forward to hearing from Professor Sir Harry Burns. Throughout this pandemic, he's the only one that seems to talk any sense to me. And finally, Gordon says, everyone who can get vaccinated should get vaccinated. Trust the doctors and the scientists. Now, Steve Richards' books and TV series on recent British Prime Ministers put him in a great position to judge the tenure of British Prime Ministers. So where stands Johnson? 2 years down, but is it later than he thinks?
Steve Richards, thank you for joining me again on the Alex Salmond Show. Now, author of The Prime Ministers, so you're in a very good place to tell us, how much trouble is Johnson now in?
Quite a lot, but the opinion polls suggest he and the Conservative Party are still ahead of Labour, the main opposition. So that gives him a certain authority still. As long as a Prime Minister is ahead in the polls in British politics, they become very authoritative and omnipotent within a government and a party. If Labour go ahead in the polls this autumn, I think he's in deep trouble, because the essence of Johnson's command is his perceived vote-winning qualities. There isn't a clear ideological direction as there was under Thatcher, and she was many times miles behind in the polls, but there was an ideological mission. He's not great with policy detail. He doesn't really understand how to manage teams. But as long as he was seen as this vote winner, he was mighty within the party and the government. If that were to go, I think he would be in real trouble, because that great asset would then be in doubt.
So this change in the weather that we've seen over the summer quite quickly, you know, Labour and the Liberal Democrats look dead as dodos, and now they've both won a by-election unexpectedly, 2 losses for the Tories. Johnson apparently has dropped 30 points in the Conservative Home popularity stakes. This is pretty dramatic stuff. Is it just a blip, a summer blip, or will it continue through the autumn?
Well, the joy of politics is its unpredictability, and we don't know. I can explain what's happening in the sense that his soaring popularity amidst quite a lot of chaos within the government could be put down to the success of the vaccine rollout across the UK, and the pandemic has dominated British politics and this sense of liberation. And I think actually a more direct connection with government than we've had for many years. You know, people were getting texts in England telling them to get vaccinated. And I think people almost thought, oh, that's Boris Johnson texting me. Or indeed in Scotland, that's, oh, Nicola Sturgeon told me, go off and be liberated from this nightmare. And that explains the soaring popularity. And the chaos of recent weeks where Boris Johnson tried to get out of self-isolating, for example.
This is after the resignation of the health secretary.
After the resignation of the health secretary, the chaos over travel plans and so on. That now means there is a sort of growing sense of chaos and incompetence to counter the near euphoria, you could almost feel it, of the vaccine rollout. So I think a lot of politics at the moment remains pandemic driven. That won't last much longer if we are through the worst of it.
So that is an extraordinary thing. You know, by any independent analysis, the performance of policy performance during the pandemic has been lamentable. It's been very poor by international standards. And yet the single success of the vaccine rollout seems to overcome everything, not just for Boris Johnson, but for Nicola Sturgeon, for the Welsh First Minister as well. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah. I think we're seeing in the UK, after years, basically since 1979, of a perception of the state being sinister. And, the great Thatcher crusade was get the state off people, set people free. A completely new perception in which it becomes the benevolent liberator from the pandemic. And I do think it is such a direct connection, the NHS and then these texts to go and get a vaccine, that it has changed the perception of those in government across the UK. Now that could well be fleeting. Public opinion is all over the place at the moment. And you're right that Boris Johnson early on made a series, you can see it. I mean, his old special advisor, Dominic Cummings, is texting about or tweeting about this all the time. You could see the mistakes, terrible mistakes. And yet Johnson, one of his arts, his skills, is to sort of, the public, according to polls, say, oh, well, you've been the same with anyone. Now that is not the case, but there is, the default position for a lot of politicians is disillusionment and betrayal, according to voters. It's taking a long time with him. The default position with him tends to be sympathy and empathy rather than that. Now that might be changing, as you suggest, with the dramatic narrowing of the opinion poll lead and decline in his personal rating.
So how much of a problem is Dominic Cummings? Is he a mere irritant, the embittered former very special advisor, or is he a real danger to the Prime Minister?
Well, views vary on this. I'll give you mine in a second. A lot of people think it's a minor irritant, that he is established as such an unreliable narrator out for revenge that his comments lack credibility. I take the opposite view. This is absolutely unique in two ways. First of all, his power within Number 10 was unique, much more powerful than previous big names like Alistair Campbell, who worked with Tony Blair. He had power over who was appointed, who was removed, including the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and so on. So he was incredibly powerful, and for more than a year saw Boris Johnson close up. And because his assessment rings true when you relate it to what we have all experienced seeing Johnson in action, I think it's going to be damaging for him. And I chaired a discussion with some political commentators for a programme the other day, and sort of spontaneously, two of them cited what Cummings had said as evidence to make sense of Johnson. And I think, therefore, the running commentary, and it's about a tweet every hour, and long blogs, is going to be damaging to him. Most voters won't read them, but these things permeate through, and it is a condemnation that sort of makes sense. It's not outrageous what he's saying. It accords with what everyone can see. And so I think it's going to be damaging to him.
And there seems to be a fair volume of text messages between the Prime Minister and his former confidant. That could spell more trouble, couldn't it?
Yeah, and he's publishing them, or some of them. And that is, I mean, it's extraordinary that he's doing that, but it does mean this isn't his narrative. These are texts. This is sort of the stuff of history, you know, that people look at the evidence. And this is actual text, not Cummings writing a year later. And so I think these are damaging. As I say, others don't think it will be. I've got a feeling it will be. And
that's quite different from an estranged political opponent, because usually that sort of stuff has to stay within some sort of bounds, because the embittered opponent wants to get back into office, perhaps. But with Dominic Cummings, it's quite different. He has no aspirations for office, and therefore it's no holds barred.
Exactly. I mean, so Boris Johnson has no levers to pull in relation to Cummings. You're absolutely right. Well, you know, if you're a leader of a party, the power of patronage or the potential patronage gives the leader considerable levers. Cummings doesn't want to go back to work with him, and therefore...
And presumably doesn't want to go into the House of Lords.
And he's not bothered about going into the House of Lords, and he certainly won't be offered a peerage now. So there is nothing in terms of what Johnson can offer him that works, and that puts him in a more dangerous place. You say that if he sacks a cabinet minister says, well, I might get back in if I behave myself. That is not part of his thinking, and that makes him more dangerous.
I want a final question before we go into some of Boris Johnson's background. You've got a recent book on people who nearly became Prime Minister. If we'd been having this discussion a couple of years back, would Boris Johnson have been in that book as opposed to being in the Prime Minister's book?
Yeah, in fact, a couple of years ago, I did a talk on the theme of Prime Ministers we never had, a series actually of talks. It's now going to be a book in September. And I then wrote an article for a newspaper saying, on the basis of those that have just missed out in the past, Johnson will not seize the crown. And I've been tormented about it ever since, you know, with people tweeting, oh, look at him, he said Johnson would never get it. I said on the basis of the past, because if you look at the qualifications of those who were Prime Ministers, on the whole, they tended to be loyal people. They tended to be people who hadn't got into much trouble up until the point they seized the crown. They tended to be unifiers rather than dividers. They could master policy detail and then sort of make it accessible to the wider electorate. Anyway, none of that he meets. But I think Brexit was the difference. The Tory party was in a state of, well, Johnson said it himself, existential crisis about its own future. And they turned to him for two reasons. That he is a vote winner. That is his one big qualification for leadership. And he was the hardline Brexiteer who could deal with the threats posed by the then Brexit party and others. So that's how he got it. But he hasn't got many of the qualifications of leadership.
Well, we'll come back and we'll discuss how Boris Johnson defied gravity and your prediction.
Join us after the break when Alex continues his conversation with journalist and broadcaster Steve Richards. We'll see you then. Welcome back. Alex is in conversation with Steve Richards about the mounting political problems of the Prime Minister.
So let's get back to the origins of Boris. I mean, Alexander Boris de Piffle Johnson. Now, I know his father Stanley Johnson is known for having a good sense of humour, but it's not the sort of name you give somebody you expect to be Prime Minister, is it?
Well, no, although it hasn't done him any harm. I gather his family don't even call him Boris. The name, very unusually, by the way, that a lot of voters refer to him as. Unusual in the sense that most Prime Ministers aren't referred to by their first
This is
name.
like the Queen then. There's
Yeah.
a family name and there's the official
Yeah,
name.
there's an official name and a family name. And yeah, it reflects a kind of showiness, which is part of the family. I mean, the father is like him, or he's like the father. They are performers. The entire family, in different ways, some more exuberant than others, are fascinated by performance. And you know, he and David Cameron and others at Eton, at Oxford, I think were fascinated by the performance of politics, the game of politics. To this very day, if you struggle to find clear definition about Johnson's broader mission, there is no doubt that in the game of politics, he's proved to be a winner on his terms.
And Johnson has a very unusual technique for a politician. It's almost as if he decided he would continue with a fairly high-risk lifestyle across a range of things, take risk in his journalism. He seemed a stranger to the actuality on various occasions, but would have the demeanour of saying, well, all that stuff doesn't matter. This is really a very unusual position to take for a modern age politician.
It's fascinating. I remember working on a programme with him occasionally when he was a journalist, and he said he wanted to go into politics. And boy, has he done it. And so, you know, whatever the traits, he has got away with things so far. Now, there will come a point, almost inevitably, when he doesn't. And there will be the fallback of all fallbacks. But it hasn't happened yet.
And has he been helped by the social media age, the transience of stories? I mean, some of the things that could have been pinned on Boris would have sunk a battleship, never mind a prime minister. But the social media age, if you just have the audacity and the temerity to stand there, then things pass.
That's a very interesting observation, because I've heard the opposite. There has been a lot of activity around highlighting what Johnson has said in the House of Commons, you know, that wasn't true, and has had millions and millions of views. But, you know, there's absolutely no doubt, if you look back at his career, editor of The Spectator, Foreign Secretary, Mayor of London, won it twice, and now Prime Minister, that is a record which suggests so far he hasn't had to face the consequences of actions.
And the Napoleon dictum, he's been a lucky general. I mean, at various key points, the cards seem to have fallen in his favour, have they?
Yeah, he was lucky to face Jeremy Corbyn and a very weak Lib Dem leader in the December 2019 election. But it was he, with great chutzpah, who kind of propelled what was then a hung parliament towards an election at a time when he wanted, you know, and all the rest of it. So yes, luck, but I mean, it's not a sole explanation of any successful leader.
Yeah, but the one thing you can be lucky in is your opponents. And the December 2019 election was the greatest political Christmas present of all time.
Yeah, and they gave it to him. They didn't have to give him the election on that date, and they did.
Well, that's the big question now. Is the luck about to run out? I mean, at the start of the summer, he appeared master of all he surveyed. Big triumphs in the local elections in England, a few pesky problems in Northern Ireland and Scotland, but nonetheless, as far as English politics are concerned, he was totally dominant. Now, as we move into the high summer and through it, things look a bit different.
Yeah, and I think the autumn will be an interesting test for him and his main opponent, the Labour leader Keir Starmer, because so far the test for Keir Starmer is how he has, on the whole, managed the politics of the pandemic, which are unique and distinct. So how he manages the politics, if it returns to normal-ish in the autumn, is a big test for him, which will then have an impact on the fate of Boris Johnson too. So Boris Johnson, it's very interesting, and it's a skill of his, has really evaded scrutiny at every point in any great sense. You know, Mayor of London's not a huge job in British politics. As Foreign Secretary, he was peripheral. Theresa May deliberately made him peripheral. During the Tory leadership contest, there were so many candidates at first, no one was really challenged. And in the general election, he avoided big interviews. So it's the leader of the opposition's task, really, to scrutinise. And he's not used to that. So that will be an interesting...
And how about internal challenges? I mean, some talk, some evidence of a rift between Prime Minister and his Chancellor. You know, the classic demise of Prime Ministers often is preceded by a rift between the occupants of Downing Street. Some evidence of that. And Dominic Cummings, of course, has said that it was a conspiracy afoot to replace him more or less as soon as he was re-elected. I mean, is Dominic Cummings just flinging in a bit of mischief, or are there forces in the Conservative Party who would quite like to see the back of Boris?
I think the Dominic Cummings comments reflects the fact that after the December 2019 election, he and his vote leave entourage in Number 10 sensed that power was waning for them.
Yeah, we're losing out to Mrs. Johnson.
She certainly is a player. You know, it's people who see the Prime Minister a lot who are players. She, by definition, sees him quite a lot. But the more interesting one, in my view, is the Rishi Sunak Chancellor versus Number 10 division, because at times, although Johnson ideologically is all over the place, but at times Johnson has made speeches where he said, call me Rooseveltian, you know, President Roosevelt, New Deal, big spending, I'm a big spender. And there's evidence that he does believe in big spending as a way of driving the economy. Sunak is a self-described fiscal conservative. So there is potentially huge tension over Johnson's ambitions for his so-called levelling up programme and other kind of big spending items versus this fiscal conservative in the Treasury, who polls suggest is incredibly popular. And how that works itself out, I think, will be one of the big themes this autumn and beyond. Now, it might go more smoothly because Boris Johnson is both a big spender, but he doesn't like tax rises and quite likes tax cuts, and he's described Margaret Thatcher as his hero, and so on. So he's not, you know, absolutely rooted in one spot. But if he decides he is Roosevelt-like and wants to emerge from the pandemic as a big spender, he will face resistance, both from the Treasury culture of sound money and from Rishi Sunak. And that could be a really titanic set of tensions over public spending, tax in the coming years.
How about other challenges? I mean, are they expecting a challenge from the north, or are they quite surprised by how little constitutional ferment there's been after the victory of the SNP in the Scottish elections?
Well, I think there will be, this will be a running theme. My view is that Johnson will not grant a referendum. He just won't do it, whatever the pressure, certainly before the next general election. And my understanding is, though that might change, in that he will have the support of Keir Starmer and the Westminster Labour Party. So you can see this being a running theme, and without clear resolution if he remains in that position. You will know more about what the options might be from the Scottish position, but the Westminster position, my understanding is he's just not going to give it this side of an election. Now that might change, but that, I think, is his current stance.
And how about perhaps his biggest danger of all, that's himself? I mean, is he congenitally incapable of governing? Once the pandemic subsides and people start to scrutinise the nuts and bolts of government, is there going to be a general decision as this man's not capable of being Prime Minister?
Well, I think you've put it well. I mean, people analyse all the time, who's the biggest threat to Boris Johnson? Is it Rishi Sunak, the popular Chancellor? Is it the populist Home Secretary and so on? I think the biggest danger to Boris Johnson is Boris Johnson. Now, one of the things that Cummings has claimed he said at the beginning of all of this is, you know, it's almost a joke that I'm being Prime Minister, but then he said, but then again, it was the same with Cameron and Osborne and all the rest of them. But he has shown no or little evidence of grasp of detail, a capacity to manage people, which is so important, especially in challenging times. His number 10 is a curious mix of people, and the cabinet was chosen partly because of their support for Brexit, partly because none of them really represented a threat to him. And so, yeah, the biggest threat to Boris Johnson is Boris Johnson, I think.
So finally, Steve Richards, offer of the Prime Minister's. You didn't think he would get there. Can he stay there?
Yeah, I didn't think he would get there on the basis of others who hadn't. I saw him having some of those characteristics of those who hadn't got the crown. So I was completely wrong. Therefore, I'm not going to make a prediction again.
Oh, go on.
Having been proven wrong about him before. What I will say is two things. One, a majority of 80 is a pretty good buttress. Now, I know Margaret Thatcher fell with a much bigger majority. And also, for all the speculation about the turmoil of his private life and all the rest of it, Prime Ministers very rarely go voluntarily. One in modern times has gone voluntarily, and that was Harold Wilson in 1976. One way or another, the others have all been forced out. So if he is to go before the next election, I doubt if it will be voluntarily. So it would have to be through force. So there would be one heck of a drama to be played out if that were to happen. So I'm not going to say anything more than give that assessment.
But we'll bring you back to talk about that drama when it comes.
You think it will?
Steve Richards, thank you so much for joining me once again on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
Before last week's recess, the joke going round the Palace of Westminster was that the Prime Minister had described his Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, as unsackable because he was the only Cabinet Secretary less popular than he was. Perhaps things will look different come the autumn. But right now, the Johnson government has become suddenly accident-prone. To lose one Health Secretary is a misfortune. To lose two by-elections, well, that's careless. What distinguishes Johnson from his Tory peers is his rare capacity for being elected. Unfortunately for him, he also possesses a rare talent for blowing himself up. There's no more experienced Prime Ministerial observer than Steve Richards. He senses storm clouds forming over Downing Street. But for now, from Alex, myself and all at the show, it's goodbye, stay safe, and we hope to see you all again next week.